No, I'm okay. Good afternoon. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Cindy Mazer, and I am the Director of ADR, Alternative Dispute Resolution, at FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. I'm also Chair of the Workplace Conflict Management section of the Interagency ADR Working Group. So both of those bodies welcome you here today. Thank you for being here. And so I'd like to just start with a few logistics. First, I want to thank all the people who helped to make this possible. So Pam Pontillo's in the back. She represents Department of Energy, which is very generous with its time and space. And all the technicians in the back all helped to make this possible. So thank you, Pam. And Elizabeth Bissell is here, and she's from FEMA, and all the people from FEMA who worked to make this possible. And Pam, do you want to name the people upstairs?
Bob Palmer and Charmaine.
Charmaine Oliphant. Those two people helped to get you in. So they're all volunteering their time to help with this. And we have Victor Voloshin, who comes from the Department of EEOC, and he's not here today, but he helps a great deal as well. So the next thing I want to talk about is our phone audience. Our phone audience is something that we're very proud of. We've built the audience up to about 200 lines, and some of those lines are international. The phone audience is also one of our biggest headaches because it's very hard to control people, and we have consistent issues with people putting their phones, or failing, let's be real honest, failing to put their phones on mute. So what happens is we will hear them at the keyboard, or they might put the phone on hold and we'll hear that elevator music, and there's nothing we can do about it, except that we get a lot of complaints. So at the end of the session, we're just weighed down with complaints and feeling rather helpless. So Pam, do you want to say anything more about that?
Well, there are times where employees in different agencies, they do put their phone on mute, and they may not realize when they do that there might be music playing. So all the participants listening by the phone hear the music, and they're not able to hear the presenter's presentation. So we really, please be aware, sometimes there's conversations going on in your office and you don't realize that all the other phone participants can hear you. We actually have more phone participants oftentimes than we do people here live. We will also make an effort that anybody that asks questions here at the presentation, we really strive to make sure that people are asking their questions and with the using the microphone. And for those folks that may want to use Wi-Fi here in the auditorium, you can connect using the password is energy.wireless. So if you have electronics, and that would be helpful to use them. The Wi-Fi password is energy.wireless. Thank you.
Super, thanks, Pam. So one more addition about people on the phone who may want to ask questions during the presentation or might want to give feedback if there's something going wrong and they need to alert us. We have Elizabeth Bissell here. She has her BlackBerry, and you can contact her at Elizabeth with an S, Bissell, B-I-S-S-E-L-L, at the initials DHS, davidhenrysam.gov. I'll say that one more time, Elizabeth with an S, Bissell, B-I-S-S-E-L-L, at the initials for the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, davidhenrysam.gov. That's for questions during the presentation, and we'll try to get them answered for you. Okay, let's turn our attention. Well, wait one second. Before we turn our attention to what's going to happen today, I just want to let you know this is our last presentation for the academic year. We have the summer off, and so do you, and we'll see you again in September. And if you have any ideas about topics that you'd like us to sponsor or create a forum around, please let us know. We'd love to take up your ideas and champion them. Okay, let's talk about today. Today was a long, hard in coming. We have canceled it twice already, and somebody sent me an email saying, "Are you sure it's going to happen? Really? Can you guarantee that? Because your track record isn't so great around this one." So we're talking about your brain on conflict, and our speaker is Juoie Sasscer-Burgos, and I want to take a minute of your time to really give you a sense of who she is, because I think you'll find this fascinating. So for starters, she's the Deputy Chief of the NSA Office of Occupational Health, Environmental, and Safety Services. That's at the National Security Agency, and that's part of the Department of Defense at Fort Meade, Maryland. So in terms of her background, she has a BS in Psychology and Spanish from Carroll College from Waukesha. Did I say that right? Waukesha, there you go, Wisconsin. And she taught English in the Peace Corps in Africa. And she returned to school and earned a Doctor of Psychology in Clinical Psychology from Baylor University in Waco, Texas. In terms of her prior positions, she was chief of the Occupational Health, Environmental, and Safety Services Division, which was had a subdivision of Psychology and Life Services. And in that position, she helped employees with their mental health and work-life balance needs. She also helped with providing expert psychological consultation to those responsible for management, personnel, and security decisions so they could select, manage, and maintain the most reliable, trustworthy, and fit workers. And when she joined the agency, she managed the pre-employment psychological evaluation for the applicants for the agency. And for 12 years prior to that, she worked at Clifton T. Perkins Hospital Center, Maryland's maximum security forensic psychiatric hospital. She was a staff psychologist, a director of admissions, and finally director of psychology. At the hospital, she was responsible for the provision of court-ordered psychological evaluations for competency to stand trial, for criminal responsibility, for risk of violence, and for treatment of those individuals who were committed to the hospital as non-competent or not criminally responsible. So are we lucky to have this speaker with us today? Just a wealth of background and richness that she's going to help us with, and we're going to understand our brain on conflict. So thank you.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. Just to do a sound check, can everybody hear me? Great. I'd like to make a couple of introductions of my own, if you don't mind. I am very lucky to have with me two distinguished guests, and they are my parents. My father has a PhD in nuclear engineering and did work for the Department of Energy way back in the days when, he just told me today, you could just drive up to the building and come in. There were no security checks, no problem with parking, no badges, and all that. His research area was, his primary area of research was ocean thermal energy conversion, or OTEC, which is early alternate energy research. My mother, alas, never worked for the Department of Energy, but has done a lot of work with the Department of Labor and the Department of Education, and has a PhD in higher education administration, and as such was both involved in a lot of conflict resolution, so much so that in one of her jobs, when she was negotiating with unions on the part of the administration, the union said that if they fired her, they would go on strike. So I was raised in a family where debate was a sport. So we are used to conflict. It's always been an interest of mine and something I've faced all my life and all my career. So Donald Sasscer and Ruth Burgos Sasscer. I'd like to make this very informal and interactive, so if you have questions, please don't feel like you have to wait until the end. That goes for the people in other sites as well. If you have questions, please go ahead and ask them. I guess calling in to Elizabeth with an S, Bissell, or contacting her. Or if you're in the audience, we have microphones. If you're in the live audience, we have microphones to ask questions. But please feel free to interrupt, ask questions, raise your hand, anything like that, anytime along the way. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about brain structures. Oh, before I get started, I know, let me just ask for the people sitting here, how many of you are in a formal conflict resolution position, such as alternate dispute resolution? Okay, all right. And how many of you are manage conflict as managers or team leads or something like that? Okay, all right.
For the record,
yeah.
Tell the people on the
Oh, okay. So it's about half and half. We have about half the people are in formal alternate dispute resolution or conflict resolution roles of whatever kind, and about half are people who are responsible for resolving conflict. And I'd like another show of hands. How many of you have been the cause of conflict? That's almost unanimous. Thank you. We'll try not to cause too much today. Okay, so we're going to talk about brain structure, brain function, brain communication, how the brain affects our behavior during conflict, and how we can affect our behavior. Our behavior can affect our brains during conflict. It's fortunately a two-way street. This is a neuroscientific explanation. As it said, it's not the only neuroscientific explanation, I just want to be clear, but it is one. And neuroscience is a branch of science that deals with the structure and function of the brain, particularly as it relates to behavior. As a psychologist, way back when I was in psychology, when you learn about the different approaches to clinical psychology, different approaches to therapy, for example, a big name that a lot of people recognize is B.F. Skinner. And he was a behaviorist and was the first big name focusing just on behavior. So his tenet was that we didn't know enough about what was happening inside of the brain in terms of emotions or what initiated behavior, And so we shouldn't study it because it was a black box and we couldn't see, it wasn't observable, we couldn't study it, so just look at the behavior. Fortunately, things have progressed since then. We know a lot more about what's going on inside of that black box, so, and that's called neuroscience, so that's what we're going to be studying today. So why do we even care? I mean, we have conflict, and obviously we all care about conflict, but why do we care what's going on in our brain during conflict? Obviously, it's because our brain influences how we interact with our environment, and our environment influences how our brain works. And once we kind of have a background in it and know some information about it, we can use that information in our either formal or informal conflict resolution or mediation situations, both at work, but by the way, it works at home too. So in order to understand conflict, we have to understand our brains this is obviously a very basic level, and our brains have some important functions. And the first one, of course, is staying alive. I think we'd all agree that that's pretty important. Perceiving, so perceiving what we see, what we hear, what we smell, what we taste, what we feel, all of that. Emoting, having emotions, expressing emotions. Thinking, of course. And acting, behaving. There are a number of different ways to kind of conceptualize how your brain functions. One of the ways that works to help understand conflict is something that was developed by Dr. Paul MacLean, the director of the Laboratory of Evolution and Behavior at NIH in the 1960s. So he came up with this way of thinking of the brain in three parts based on the evolutionary age and the function of the brain. The basic idea is that as we evolved, obviously some parts of the brain evolved first, and then more got added on, and more was added on. All right? So the first part of the brain, when you think about this evolutionarily, reptiles developed before mammals, for the most part. And so the oldest part of the brain that we're talking about is the reptilian brain. All right? It's also called the reptilian system, the R complex, or the hindbrain. The hindbrain, by the way, we'll talk about the hindbrain, the midbrain, and the forebrain. That's vestiges of when we, or other animals, walked on all fours. And the hindbrain is kind of at the brain stem, at the base of the brain. But when you're walking on all fours, it's actually hind. And then there's midbrain and forebrain. Now, of course, we're upright, so I guess you could call it the bottom brain, midbrain, and top brain, but that's not what people call it. So, and this is the oldest part of the brain, and it's involved in the most basic functions. Regulation of unconscious body functions such as breathing, heart rate, digestion, circulation, behaviors related to self-preservation, sex, eating, defending your body, defending your food source, and enacting the fight, flight, or freeze response.
Hey, Julie, we just
yes.
got a couple emails from folks on the phone, and
Okay.
they were having a little trouble hearing. You're a little soft, so if you could speak a little louder, that would be helpful.
I'll try to speak louder.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Maybe the mic has to be adjusted.
A
I
little
don't know.
higher?
Might be.
Okay, is that any better?
That sounds a little louder, yeah.
All right. I'll try. I know I have a soft voice. Just wave your hands and, go like that, and I'll try to speak a little louder. So as you can imagine, a lot of these things are very important in conflict. Even the most basic things, breathing, when there's conflict, your breathing tends to speed up. Your heart rate speeds up. Your digestion slows down so that you can take care of the conflict first and digest later. Your circulation may speed up. You're going to be engaged in particular behaviors to, defend your food, and so on. So the reptilian brain is very important in conflict. The next part of the brain that evolved was the mammalian brain. Mammals are a little bit more complex behaviorally than reptiles, for the most part. Obviously, mammals also have the reptilian brain, so there's a lot of overlap, a lot of similarities. But mammals can do things that most reptiles can't. So the paleocortex, paleomammalian brain, limbic system, midbrain, these are all the things that are pretty much in the middle of the brain. The reptilian brain is at the bottom, at the base of the skull. The mammalian brain, or the midbrain, is kind of inside, in the middle, right about there. And so at this point, you have consciousness, thought, memory, emotion, triggering the fight, flight, or freeze response. Not just enacting it, but there are things that go on in the mammalian brain that can trigger the reptilian brain to do the fight, flight, or freeze. And for the first time, a lot of social connections. It's not that reptiles don't have any of this, they just have less of it. There are some reptiles, for example, that take care of their young and make social connections and so on, but not as much. And there are some mammals that are solitary and so on. But these are general ways of thinking of it. And then the last part to evolve, the top part of the brain, the neocortex, then also called the neomammalian brain, the human brain, and the forebrain. And that's the part that a lot of times when we see pictures of brains we think of, that's the bumpy, convoluted, up and down, looks like little hills and mountains stuff that you see in a lot of brains, a lot of pictures of brains. It's more on the outside and more on the top, and it goes from behind your eyes to the back of your skull. And this is involved in sensory perception, motor commands, spatial reasoning, language, conscious thought, including the conscious interpretation of an emotional state. And that'll become more important later. We'll talk about that later. But that's the part of your brain that makes you aware that during conflict, well, A, that you're having conflict, and B, that during conflict you are either angry or excited or scared or depressed or whatever it is you're feeling. You become aware of what you're feeling using this part of your brain. Let me back up a little. The neocortex has 4 main areas that are called lobes. And the first one we're going to talk about is the occipital lobe. That's right in the back of your skull. It's not as involved in conflict as some of the other parts of the brain, but it has a lot to do with visual reception, visual spatial processing, movement and color recognition. This is the part of your brain that if you slip when you're ice skating and you smack the back of your head really hard, if you hit it back here, that's when you might see stars. That's when the neurons in that part of your brain have been smushed a little bit, and it makes them think that they're seeing colors or lights, and people report that as seeing stars. Hopefully, your conflict resolution does not come to that point. The parietal lobe, that's kind of in the middle top between the occipital lobe is in the back, and this is kind of the middle on the top, kind of like if you were wearing earmuffs over the top there in the middle. Sensory integration. This section is involved in sensory integration. So this is where you're going to be pulling together hearing, sound, taste, and so on, and making sense of it. Spatial sense and navigation, knowledge of numbers and their manipulation, speech and language. I imagine there are a lot of people in the federal government who have tremendous language skills. They're using their parietal lobes all the time. The people in the Department of Energy and the mathematicians where I work and so on have a lot of knowledge of numbers and their manipulation. This is something that, this is kind of the stuff you go to school for, the stuff you learn practicing and developing. The next lobe we're talking about is the temporal lobe, which is right above your ears, right kind of in here, in this area here, both sides. It's very involved in auditory processing, which is conveniently located next to the ears, so the sound doesn't have to travel very far, or not the sound, but the reactions to the sound don't have to travel very far. Semantic processing, making sense of the sounds that you hear that just happen to be words, and you understand the words. It's very important in the formation of memory and the discrimination of smells and sounds. And then the frontal lobes. The frontal lobes are about from midpoint on your brain forward, all the way to just behind your eyes. So going all the way this way. They are the largest lobes of the brain. They are more developed in humans than in most species, which is kind of a large reason why we have kind of curving foreheads instead of flat foreheads. We have more stuff in there than a lot of other animals. This is where a lot of abstract thinking happens. Thought analysis or metacognition, so kind of thinking about thinking. This is regulation of behavior. This is where you're making conscious decisions about whether you're going to behave in a particular way. Mediation of conflicting thoughts. When you get conflicting information, your frontal lobes are going to try to figure out how to resolve that, how to make sense of it. Making choices between right and wrong. You can see how this all ties into conflict resolution, conflict management. Predicting the probability of outcomes of actions and events. Coincidentally, this is the last area to really develop in humans. So you might notice that teenagers don't quite have this part down yet, but it gets better. They get better. Social control and suppressing emotional or sexual urges. This is where, your mammalian brain may say, wow, I'm going to go for that. And your frontal lobes, fortunately, can say, that might not be a good idea because I can predict the probability that the outcome won't be good if I do that, so I'm going to not proceed the way my mammalian brain or my reptilian brain wants me to. Okay, so the prefrontal cortex, which is all part of the frontal lobe, but the prefrontal cortex is right here, right in the front. And it's the seat of the executive function of the brain. And it's just what it sounds like. That's where you're making decisions, management decisions about your behavior, management decisions about how you're going to conduct your life. Back in the day, when they did frontal lobotomies, that's where they did them. They kind of put in little egg beaters and chopped up the prefrontal cortex. They stopped doing them because it didn't work very well. It may have calmed people down, but it also made them unable to do the functions, or virtually, almost completely, unable to do the functions that we want them to do. Okay, so if the prefrontal cortex and the frontal lobes are all that, if they're really that much in control and they're making these logical decisions and they're doing that, why don't we just use those? Why even engage the rest of the brain? Well, there are a few reasons for that. The main reason is we don't have any choice. The other parts of the brain are working with or without our consent. So if you think back to the reptilian brain, the most basic functions like breathing and heart rate and so on are not under our conscious control. I mean, we can control our, you can hold your breath for a little bit and you can artificially, or not artificially, but you can lower your blood pressure by using meditation. And there are different things that you can do. But you can only control it so much. For the most part, it just happens on its own. Just like the fight, flight, or freeze response may happen on its own. Those parts of the brain have evolutionarily been around for a long time. If they didn't work, we would not have survived. So they work pretty darn well. They're very good at their jobs. And they're very important. Those are the parts of the brains that keep us alive and have allowed, and so the reptilian brain has kept us alive. The mammalian brain has allowed us to be parts of groups, and humans are very social animals. The older parts of the brains are pre-conscious for the most part, although there's some consciousness in the mammalian brain, but so we can't avoid using them if we want, even if we wanted to. In addition, just because they may be more automatic, more unconscious, and are not logically thinking through, they can provide us with information that is very important that we don't want to ignore. We should take it into consideration. It might not always be right, but it might be important to notice. Okay, so the prefrontal cortex, and for all of its sophistication, is not always right. If we think things through logically, rationally, that's not always right. We don't always have all of the information that we need to begin with, so we may have faulty premises, and we may not be paying attention to emotions and other things that need to go into the mix to make our decisions. So your prefrontal cortex kind of evolved to understand things and to make decisions. So it really loves understanding. So that's the part of your brain. It's going to try to understand, to make sense what you see, what you hear, what you feel, what's going on in the room, how people are behaving, what information you have. It's going to try to make sense of that. So it's going to consider input from other parts of the brain, and it's going to pull it into as coherent an understanding as it can. Okay? However, you don't always have all of the information you need. You don't always have the whole thing. As you all know, there are always two sides to a story, sometimes 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 sides. And if you don't have all of the information, you may be making decisions on incomplete information. And if your brain recognizes that it's not quite complete, your brain is likely to fill in the blanks and drag in other information that might be similar or might be relevant. There, on a very basic level, your brain will form a gestalt. Like if they've done studies that show, like if somebody is presented with a picture of the letter C, and it's almost a complete circle, it's just a little tiny gap. The ends of the C don't quite touch. There's a small gap. Your brain will remember that as a circle, even though it's not quite a circle, because your brain will fill in the blanks. And it does that with more complex things too, not just with simple images. That's just an easy one to research. And when you have more than one person in the room, as you often do when you're mediating conflict, different people's brains are going to bring in different material. So their understandings may conflict, even if each one is convinced they've rationally arrived at the correct understanding.
Julie, I have a question from the audience,
Yes.
the telephone audience.
Yes.
When does the prefrontal cortex form? Are some teenagers literally incapable of certain decisions because of lack of development in this area?
Well, the prefrontal cortex obviously it starts to develop in utero, but it continues to develop throughout childhood, infancy, childhood, and into young adulthood. It's in pretty good shape by age 25 or so. So obviously there's a lot of individual variability, but some teenagers really don't, all of their neural connections are not quite where they will be in a few years. So some of them really are, it's not an all or none thing, so it's not that they're incapable of making decisions, but they may not be capable of making as good a decisions as they will be able to make later. Through no fault of their own, that's just the way their brain is developing. They're just not quite there. But as somebody who's raised a couple of teenagers, the short answer is, yeah, sometimes they're not capable. Let's see. Okay, we've got that. Okay, so what we've learned about the brain, during conflict. Obviously, conflict was around long before the neocortex developed. Reptiles and even very primitive animals experienced conflict, obviously. Thinking of early humans, for example, something wanted to eat you. You didn't want to be eaten. That's conflict. It's been around forever. Okay, so the brain had to, now we have the luxury of having very sophisticated understandings of the world. We all have we work for the federal government. We all have very complex jobs with complex goals that interweave with each other. But even when it was very, but when we were evolving, it was more basic, and we could have been eaten, and we could have been damaged in other ways, and so we had to have a brain that would work very fast in order to keep us alive. The more basic stuff, we didn't necessarily have the luxury of being able to analyze all the novel stimulation, all the novel input we were getting every time we saw it. Our decisions had to be fast, and they had to keep us safe. So during conflict, we had to make very quick decisions about what things, animals, and actions are. Okay, so this is a berry bush. I can get food from it. That's a lion. I might be food for the lion. That's a really important distinction, by the way. So, and then we had to judge whether or not this was good or bad. So if it's a berry bush, of course, it's good. You might be able to eat the berries. If it's a lion, it's bad. All right? And then you had to decide, your brain had to recognize what things were, judge whether it was good or bad, and then come up with a reaction. So the reaction is based on the other two things, the recognition and the judgment. So if you have a berry bush, you can approach to eat the berries. If it's a lion, you want to run. All right, so when you're thinking about conflict resolution, a lot of people will say, a lot of what people are trying to decide is whether or not something is good or bad. Is something to be good or bad for them? Maybe it's a change in their position. Maybe it's their annual evaluation. Maybe it's the way a team is being organized. It could be any number of things. But they have to judge whether something is good or bad. So if you think about it evolutionarily, animals have evolved to judge more things as bad than good because the cost of judging something as good and being wrong is too high. It's not that high when we're sitting around in our offices, or, well, it could be, but it's sometimes not high when we're sitting around in our offices. But if we were still living on the savannah, you mistake what a lion is, your food. It's better to erroneously run away from the food and live to eat later than to misinterpret a lion as food and be eaten. So implications when you're negotiating conflict. If something's unfamiliar or amiss or even unclear, the natural inclination is to judge it as bad. Now, a lot of people will tell you, yeah, if you're making any change, a third of the people will say, yeah, let's go for it. A third of the people will say, no, I won't accept that under any circumstances. And a third of the people will say, let's see how it goes, and then I'll decide. It's not all that simple. Generally, unless it's proven to, unless people have specific understanding in how it can be good for them, their natural inclination for most things is first to assume it's bad until they get more information, or at least be cautious about it, at least be suspicious about it. That doesn't mean that they're not going to come around in the end, and it doesn't mean that they're not an optimistic or a good person. It just means they're being cautious, and this is how we have evolved to be. Okay? So if somebody's behaving in an unpredictable way, unpredictable may be good, or it may be bad, or it may be neither, could be irrelevant, but the natural inclination is to judge it to be dangerous or bad until we have more information. Okay, so so here's an example of, some change people are going to judge to be great. If they want to, pay us $1 million, I think that would be a great change. And I suspect that everybody else would too. But if somebody just walks in and says, okay, all you federal employees, there's going to be a change to your salary, the first inclination will be, uh-oh. Unless we hear what that change is, unless we hear that it's increasing, we're going to assume it's going to be something bad. Okay, so a large part of the response to a stimulus is emotion. And emotion has two main purposes. One is to produce reactions to specific situations and to physically prepare the organism to respond in the way most likely to result in survival. When you're producing reactions, you can make the decision, or you can approach something, approach a berry bush to eat it, approach somebody for sex, or to make friends with them, or to ask them to join your family group, or to, in our work settings with a team, ask them to join your team. Or, other than approach, you can become defensive and fight, flight, or freeze. And in the physical preparation of the organism, setting off the sympathetic nervous system is one. So the sympathetic nervous system is the part of your body the system in your body that's going to prepare you physically for fight, flight, or freeze. That means your heart rate will start going up so that blood circulates faster in your body, so more oxygen gets around so that you can use your muscles more effectively to run or to fight. It speeds up your breathing, so for the same reasons. You get more oxygen in your lungs. It's going to slow down your digestion. It's going to slow down the non-immediately essential things. it can also prepare you to form relationships. So emotions begin in the paleomammalian brain. It's not that reptiles, we don't really know whether reptiles have emotions or not. Well, we don't really know for sure that animals that don't speak and can explain they have emotions have emotions or not, although there's a lot more evidence that they do. Anybody who has dogs or cats or horses or whatever, even if the research isn't very specific and the horse doesn't talk like Mr. Ed, are pretty sure that their companion animals have emotions. So the paleomammalian actions are pre-conscious, and we can't initially control our emotions. A lot of people will say, you know, control your emotions, control your emotions. Well, you can't always control your emotions. You might be able to control your behavior, but you can't necessarily your reaction to the emotions. But you can't always control your emotions. So people have emotions. That's what happens. That's why we have that part of the brain. We have emotions. It's not something that you can just say, don't have emotions. That's anybody who's a fan of Star Trek knows that, despite Spock's best efforts. They happen, and they happen quickly. And there's evidence to suggest that they happen even before we're aware of them. So there are some instances like I was in a car accident once, and it happened so quickly, I didn't have time to be afraid, but my body responded with the sympathetic nervous system, so probably I was afraid, but it happened so quickly, I didn't know it. In retrospect, I look back and I went, holy cow, that was bad, but at the time, I didn't recognize that. Okay, so there are more neural pathways from the amygdala in the limbic system, that is, from the midbrain, the mammalian brain, into the neocortex than the other way around. So it's easier for the limbic system to overwhelm the neocortex with emotion than it is for the neocortex to tamp down the emotions that are stemming from the limbic system. Let me back up a little. Okay. That doesn't mean that there's nothing we can do about it. We can work on those connections, work on the neural pathways. We can exercise them and develop them just like, you know, if I worked on basketball, I would get better at it. Obviously, I'm never going to play in the NBA. I'm never going to be that good at it, but I could get better at it. And some people can get really, really good at it. We can form more neural pathways. This is just what happens left to its own devices in most human, in our settings. Okay, so if humans had the ability to control emotion, they'd be able to choose what emotion they want to feel. They would be able to choose to never be afraid. They'd be able to choose who to love. Boy, there would be a lot of parents who would be happy if their kids could choose who to love instead of just happening. You'd be able to choose to be happy all the time. There would be no depression. There would be, people cannot control their emotion that easily. If humans had the ability to control emotion, there'd be no need for artificial stimulation like roller coasters or sports or movies or recreational drugs. So humans like these things because they evoke the emotions they like to feel. And the emotions could be warmth or interest or piquing your intellectual curiosity. Yes, do you want to use the microphone to ask your question, please?
What about the research about, for instance, like practicing gratitude? And if I continue to practice gratitude, then I feel more gratitude during the day. Isn't that, in a sense, a choice and being able to control our emotions?
It is, and by practicing, you can develop more of those neural pathways that help you practice, help you feel more gratitude. Yes, you can, but it does take practice. It's not an automatic thing. It's just like if you work at basketball, you'll get better at basketball. If you work at practicing those things, it can help.
Well, I guess all I'm trying to, so there is some space for us to choose our emotions.
Well, you're not actually choosing the emotion in that case. You're choosing to focus on gratitude. You probably have some gratitude already. You're choosing to focus on it, and you're choosing to link those neural pathways to each other. I'll get into a little bit more later about how you can do that.
And I have a second question, if that's okay.
Yes, that's okay. Sure.
I've been really intrigued recently with the writing on cognitive dissonance and our propensity to tell ourselves stories to match our actions. So, so I'm recycling. They do these studies. So everybody recycles because all of their neighbors are recycling. And then they tell themselves that they recycle because they really care about the environment. But as soon as you take them out of that context and no one else is recycling, they also stop recycling. So I guess I have a question about that in terms of like where does it all start? It doesn't necessarily all start in the brain.
No, it doesn't necessarily start. Your brain is reacting to the environment around you. Mm-hmm. So, some things can start in the brain, or they can start in the environment. But for the most part, your brain is taking in, what you see, what you hear, what you smell, what you touch, what you feel kinesthetically. Are you in balance or not? So, your brain is trying to make sense of that and is reacting to that. So it doesn't, your brain doesn't exist in a vacuum. Yeah. It starts, where it starts, some things, hunger starts within you, some things start within you, some things start outside.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay, so I guess we've anticipated this question a little bit, but so are we totally out of control? Fortunately not. While we can't instantly control our emotions, we can, on a good day, control our behavioral reaction to their emotions. Some people are better at controlling their behavior than others, as you might have noticed, but most of us, on a good day, can control our behavioral reactions to the emotions. So just because you get angry or sad or scared or happy doesn't mean you have to behave in a way that's going to be inappropriate. And so the monitoring of the behavior is in the prefrontal cortex, and that's what's conscious. So that's what we can consciously control the behavior, the reaction to the emotions. Once we become aware of the emotions, we can use them to help figure out what caused that reaction. And once we know the cause, we can engage our prefrontal cortex and slowly influence the limbic system to reinterpret the data. So sometimes, like when you're in a conflict resolution setting, sometimes you can have a visceral reaction to something. You can have an emotional reaction to something before you really understand what it is you're reacting to. So there are times when you have a sense, maybe you have a sense that something's just not quite right. Something is, something is bothering you. You're feeling uncomfortable. You may not know why. You may figure it out later. But the fact that you recognize the discomfort in yourself may lead you to explore, ask some more questions, get some more information, find out a little bit more about what's going on. So it can actually be helpful for you to recognize your emotions, to help control the behavior, but also to help make sense of what's going on. Okay, so how do parts of the brain communicate? The adult human brain is made up of approximately 100 billion brain cells or neurons. That's a lot. There are whole bunches of them. And the neurons are connected to each other, and they send both chemical and electrical signals to transmit information. So a neuron is a nerve cell, a brain cell. They're usually would kind of have like a, if you kind of shaped like a hand and an arm, typically. There are a few different shapes, but you have a cell body, and you have little short branches sticking out of it, and then you have a long piece with a few small branches sticking out the end. I'll get into that in a little more detail. So a chemical signal comes into the dendrite. So these things, these short things that are sticking out, these are the dendrites, and this is where signals come in from other cells. Sometimes a signal will come into this part, this is the axon, and sometimes the signals will come into the cell body, but usually they'll come into the dendrites. If you get enough signals in, every time you get a little chemical signal in, it's going to charge the cell a little bit more, and if you get enough, if it's excited enough, it's going to fire. And it's going to fire, so the chemical signals come in, excite the neuron, and if it gets excited enough, it's going to fire an electrical signal, an electrical impulse down the long stem, which will then connect to the next cell. The connection between two neurons, so it comes in here, goes out there, between here and the next cell down here, the little space in between, or where they connect, is called a synapse. So some signals that come in make it fire, some inhibit cell action. I'll get into that a little bit too. So the chemical part of neural communication. There are neurotransmitters. Those are chemicals that come out of one neuron, float across the little synapse in the cerebral spinal fluid, and fit into a receptor on the next cell. If it builds excitement, it's an excitatory neurotransmitter. If it diminishes excitement, it's an inhibitory neurotransmitter. So most cells have many synapses, like if it's like this. Each one might have little branches, so it has many places where the signals might come in and where they might leave. Some are receiving excitatory chemicals and some receiving inhibitory transmitters. The more a neuron fires, the more dendrites and axon terminals it grows. So the more this neuron is exercised, the more little branches it's going to have. And this is where the practice comes in. So if you're practicing gratitude or practicing basketball or practicing anything, the more you use it, the more little connections it's going to make, and the more it's going to come in and the more it's going to come out. The same thing would be true if you're, conjugating French verbs. The more you practice, the easier it's going to be to do, because there are going to be more connections, more ways for the signals to be transmitted. With conscious effort and practice, okay. The increased connections in the neurocortex can make the desired paleomammalian neurons develop with time. It's not instantaneous. It's like most things. It takes time. And the same would be true with in conflict resolution settings. You practice, you get better. And Okay, so there are also some things called neuromodulators. And a neuromodulator is a chemical that modifies the efficacy of the synapse. So when the signal goes from one cell to another, how much of the chemical connects to the next cell, or how easy it is to get to the next cell, and how much gets sucked into the next cell, can all be modulated by a neuromodulator. They generally float around in a diffuse area, like they float around in the cerebrospinal fluid. They're not directly in the synapse, but if they're floating around, and it should have an effect on the cell and on the synapse. Most neuromodulators also function as neurotransmitters in other parts of the system. It's a very complex system, and it would be a whole nother, college courses on this. So the most common neurotransmitters are glutamate, which usually excites a cell, gamma-aminobutyric acid, or GABA, which usually inhibits a cell. Those are the two most common. There are neuromodulators that affect whether the GABA or the glutamate or the GABA are working. The neuromodulators, there are a whole bunch of neuromodulators, but these are the ones that are most relevant to conflict resolution. There's histamine, which affects arousal. So histamine can make make it easier to become aroused. That's why, like when you take an antihistamine for allergies or something like that, you become drowsy, because the histamine is what contributes to arousal, and you're anti that. Vasopressor can affect aggression. Norepinephrine, which is essentially adrenaline, activates this sympathetic nervous system. Oxytocin, bonding with other humans. Dopamine, pleasure. And serotonin, relaxation. So these are the ones that are important when we're thinking about conflict resolution. So the neuromodulators that are important in calming, caring, and sociability, all of those things are important in conflict resolution. And if you don't have enough, individuals can be irritable, aggressive, and bullying. And if you have enough, they can develop a caring response, calm down fear, calm down anxiety, and calm down anger reactions. So if you think about it, we want to increase the good neuromodulators and decrease the problematic ones. So how do we do this? How do we increase the good stuff? Okay, so oxytocin is something that you see a lot in, for example, mother and infant pair bonds. Your oxytocin levels are the highest when you are nursing a child or taking care of a baby, or, it's that kind of thing that brings out the wanting to care for somebody else, wanting to have a bond with somebody else. You can increase it by touching, by sharing resources, by sex. Not that I'm recommending we use all of those during conflict resolution, but we can use some of them. And it's used it comes up when you form warm relationships with others in your group. Dopamine, which obviously has to do with pleasure. What can increase dopamine? Pleasant views, favorite music, perfume, not for those who are sensitive to chemicals, but for some people. For me, the smell of chocolate chip cookies. There may be different smells for different people that are going to increase pleasure. Comfortable clothes, just things that are going to put you at ease. It's going to vary a little bit by person to person. And favorite activities can increase your pleasure. Serotonin, relaxation. Serotonin is not created by the body. Your body doesn't kick it out, so it's got to come from what you ingest, food and drink. So foods containing tryptophan, like turkey, and protein are going to be the best for this. Medication, SSRIs, like Prozac was the first one, Zoloft, Paxil, those medications are called SSRIs, which are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And the way they work is serotonin is in a cell, and the cell at the end of the axon will, when it gets excited enough, will release the serotonin. The serotonin will float across the synapse and get to the next cell. But it doesn't. But serotonin is very precious. Neurotransmitters are very precious to the body. There's not a lot of it there. So the body doesn't want to waste any of it. So if it doesn't all get into the receptors on the receiving cell, the cell that shot it out will suck it back in. And that's called reuptake. So a reuptake inhibitor is going to stop the cell from sucking it back up, giving the serotonin more of a chance to get across the synapse and do its work. So that's how the SSRIs work. They're selective because they're selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors because they only work on serotonin, not on other chemicals, or for the most part. There's some recent research that's gone into the study of conflict in non-human animals. And the old thinking was that aggression and dominance led to higher social status, and this status led to more opportunities to mate, reflecting higher evolutionary fitness. Because obviously, evolutionarily, it's all about the continuity of the species, and if you can reproduce, you're in good evolutionary shape. Recent genetic testing, though, has shown that in most mammals, primates, wild horses, and wolves, there are 3 specific studies I looked at, interestingly, the offspring do not necessarily belong to the most dominant, aggressive males. So apparently the females are mating with non-dominant males at least as often. The wild horses, there will be a dominant male usually in any wild horse group, and they're the ones that keep the predators away and lead the group and so on, and they're very important to the group. But apparently they're not necessarily the ones that are having the most offspring. With wolves, they used to think that wolves were unrelated groups in a pack, and they would fight for dominance. What they have found is that most wolf packs are actually a family. They're all biologically related to each other. The dominant male and the dominant female are usually the mother and the father. They have offspring, and the other adults are older offspring, primarily. And whether the older offspring, they may challenge the parents, like teenagers do, but typically what happens if they survive to adulthood is they go off and form their own packs. Very rarely do they fight to the death the way it's portrayed in movies and so on. Dr. Swami of the Laboratory of Comparative Ethology from the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development at NIH published some research in 2005 on rhesus monkeys' aggression and serotonin level. So monkeys who are more aggressive risk takers were found to have lower levels of serotonin. And remember, the serotonin is related to relaxation, so that all makes sense. More of them died before reproducing. Part because the females weren't necessarily just reproducing with them, but also because if they're more aggressive and they're risk takers, they're getting into more fights, They're the ones exploring and maybe getting closer to the crocodiles or rhesus monkeys, probably not crocodiles, but, getting eaten by larger, meaner species. More of them died before reproducing. Monkeys with higher levels of serotonin had the most prosocial behavior. And the male monkeys with higher levels of serotonin and the most prosocial behavior, the most grooming and bonding with females. And more of them lived to reproduce. So reproductive success was not correlated with larger canine teeth or body size. It was negatively correlated with aggressive behavior. Less aggressive males who'd formed good relationships with females were able to lead the troops after the deaths of the aggressive males with the support of the females. So when we're thinking about conflict resolution, we're not to say that we are the same as rhesus monkeys or other species, but people who get aggressive and are very forceful in the long run are not necessarily the most successful. They may get their way at that particular moment, but they may be harming their bonds with other people. And in the long run, not that they're likely to die in our work settings, but they may professionally not get as much done as the people who are less aggressive and working more collaboratively with others. And high serotonin may be important in forming bonds, keeping calm, fostering relaxation. This is not to say that those people, that low serotonin individuals, are not evolutionarily helpful. They're the ones that are going to take the risks, and they're going to be the first ones to eat the unfamiliar berry. So if it's poisonous and they die, well, that was bad for them. They didn't live to reproduce, but it helps the group because the group learns, okay, we're not going to eat those particular berries. So it helps the whole group. They're going to be the ones that are going to be in your groups that are pushing. Maybe on the team, they're going to be the ones that are going to want to take the most risks. It's not always the right thing to do, but if you're working in a team, it's usually helpful to have somebody who's willing to push the envelope and they may have, in our settings, more vision and more willingness to stretch. Okay, so when serotonin is low, we may have trouble inhibiting aggressive response and perceived verbal or physical threats, responses to perceived verbal or physical threats. And to increase harmony, we want to increase serotonin and avoid situations that decrease serotonin. Okay, so a quick review of what we've had. So the parts of the brain evolved at different times. The older parts are more solid and cannot be instantly overridden by conscious thought. Not to say that they can't be influenced by conscious thought, but it's not instant. Emotions and reactions have been around for a long time, and they're durable and strong. New stimuli are more likely to be judged as bad than as good. Neuromodulators can help influence how cells react, and we want to maximize the relaxation, bonding, and pleasure neuromodulators when we are trying to resolve conflict or manage conflict. It can't always be resolved, but it can often be managed. Okay, so with all this information, what do we want to do about it? Okay, keep in mind that all parts of people's brains are working. When people have a lot of higher education, we tend to be very much, as we say, in our heads. Really what we mean is in our frontal lobes. And we're thinking rationally, and we're thinking about what are the reasons why we're doing things and judging things. It's important to keep in mind that that's not the only part of your brain that's working. And it's not the only part of other people's brains that are working. Okay? Also, though, keep in mind that we can influence how our brain functions, and we can accept and understand what we can't influence. There are some things that are so basic, we're not going to be able to influence them, so we just need to keep them consideration, we can work around them, we can find ways to mitigate maybe the effect they're having on the group. Okay, so in general, we want to recognize the functioning of the paleomammalian brain and maximize the influence of the neocortex. And we want to increase calming, caring neurotransmitters. So in your situations where you're setting up, where you're doing conflict mediation or having a contentious team meeting, or just in your everyday work, depending on how what your job is, you want to set up the environment to be as non-threatening as possible, paying attention to all of your senses, so sight, sound, smell, touch, and taste. If you can, and not everybody has these options depending on how your office is set up, but play soft music in the reception area until the discussion starts, because pleasurable sounds increase dopamine. Now, music obviously is subject to taste, so generally for most humans, soft classical music is going to help a lot of people and not cause problems for others primarily. You want to serve food and drinks if possible. Turkey sandwiches are ideal. Obviously, people can't go around eating turkey sandwiches all day long. That's just not practical. But if you were in a situation where you could, turkey sandwiches would be ideal because they have tryptophan. If not turkey, other kinds of protein helps, especially if it's got a little bit of fat and a little bit of carbohydrates. But you don't, we all know you don't want to overdo the carbs and the sugar or people are going to crash. That's going to be counterproductive. Keep in mind that offering any food, even if people don't eat it, even if they can't, offering food is still a universal sign of affiliation. So even if you have a jar of candy on the table or a jar of candy on the desk or apples or something around, even if people don't eat it, and even if it's not kind of a lunch kind of situation or some place where they can eat, they're going, whether it's conscious or not, it's going to be seen as a sign of affiliation, and that helps the perception that we're all part of the same tribe, we're all part of the same group. Hopefully that translates to we all have the same ultimate goals. You want to shake hands. Obviously, it depends on whether or not it's culturally appropriate, and you have to pay a lot of attention to that. But in our culture here, primarily, people shake hands in work situations. So even slight touch increases oxytocin. You want to start with a ritual. I found that in large organizations where people are meeting with new people all the time, or maybe they're familiar with some of the people and not the others, the ritual where I work is everybody goes around the room, introduces themselves. I'm Juoie Sasscer-Burgos. I'm the Deputy Chief of Occupational Health, Environmental, and Safety Services, and I'm here to fill in the blank. Then the next person goes. And even if you know most of the people around the room, it's just kind of, a little ritual we do. It helps people feel at home, helps them feel more calm. Usually doesn't help very long. It usually doesn't take very long. It's usually pretty helpful in getting people to relax. And just like our frontal cortex likes understanding, the reptilian brains like predictability. And remember that information that is ambiguous or unfamiliar will likely be interpreted negatively. That is, until they know more information. Okay, so you want to present information as clearly as possible with direct explanations of how it will not hurt the participants, and you want to tell them how they will gain from it. And this may need to be repeated or rephrased several times. Okay, so even when the information is clear, if it appears to lead to a loss for the individual, there will likely be negative emotion attached. Sometimes that's unavoidable. we had a situation where I work where people living in Hawaii were being paid a certain amount of money because it's more expensive to live in Hawaii than to live even in the DC area. So they were being paid a little bit more. Well, rules changed, things happened, and we could no longer pay them that amount. We had to pay them the same as they would be making in DC. There are no two ways about that. That was a loss for them. You know, you can't sugarcoat that. So people were upset. They were angry. You don't want to ignore that, and you don't want to pretend like it's not okay for them to be angry. It would be normal for them to be angry. That's what happens when people take away some of your pay. And you just have to accept that and practice being comfortable with other people's negative emotions. That's just something you can do when you're negotiating conflict. You just have to accept that sometimes other people are going to be upset. It's not always easy, but you probably wouldn't. If you're a manager, you have no choice. If you're working in like alternative dispute resolution, you really have no choice because that's kind of your job. You want to acknowledge the negative emotions. And, here's another reason for acknowledging it. If you don't acknowledge the negative emotions and you don't validate that, yeah, that's a reasonable thing to feel, if your money is taken away or something like that, people may feel like they are not being heard, and they may feel the need to escalate. You don't understand. This is bad for me. How am I going to pay my mortgage? I bought this really expensive house so my kids could be in this really good school district, and now you're taking away, this money, and I don't know how I'm going to do this. If you don't acknowledge what they're going through, they may have to step it up and pound on the table or stand up or stomp out, or they may have to escalate in some other way. So you want to acknowledge what they're feeling. And make sure they understand that you understand what they're feeling, that you know what they're feeling. And also when there's negative emotion, and if it's not something that you can't resolve, often you can appeal to the greater good. Even if they're going to have negative feelings about that particular issue, you can appeal to the greater good. And sometimes this leads to an activation of the paleo-mammalian cortex that seeks affiliation. If you can step back and say, we're all in this together, we're all working towards the same goal of, not breaking the law or following the direction of the president or whatever it is, we're all Americans here, we're all trying to protect our country, or whatever it is that's the greater good. By including them in that, you are including their feeling or increasing their feelings of affiliation, of being a member of the group. And then, of course, remember that while calming and caring is helpful, it's going to take some time to make a difference. You want to go slow. It's hard, your reptilian brain is the fastest, then the paleo-mammalian brain has been around for a while, and it's pretty good at what it does. And the neocortex is very helpful. It makes us human, but it's not as fast as the others. And so when you're trying to develop all those extra connections that are going to help you with the other parts of your brain, don't expect too much. It's going to be slow, but it can happen. And hopefully all of us can help make it happen. And that's it. I will open it up for questions. Or if I've already explained everything perfectly, that's okay too. Yes.
My name is Brian Block. I work at the Department of the Interior. Maybe I don't mean to say this facetiously, but could someone conclude from your presentation that we as conflict resolvers should have a case of Prozac, ready at any given time? I mean, I say that jokingly, but because so much of it was presented that, chemical things are so important, where do we kind of draw the line? Not giving out turkey sandwiches or...
Yeah. Well, other than the fact that it wouldn't be legal,
Right.
and that Prozac takes weeks to kick in, sure, that's a good idea. No, I mean, it's not perfect, and if we could somehow infuse people with Prozac in advance, there might be some advantages to that. But you can't really do that, obviously. We want to make sure that we do what we can. And for some people, Prozac or Zoloft or Paxil or one of the others is helpful, because some people, just like some people are better at basketball than I am, no matter how much I practice, some people are going to be more anxious than others, no matter how much they practice. It doesn't mean practice won't help them. Practice will help everybody. But some people are going to have a harder time than others. So for those people, they can make the decision in conjunction with their healthcare provider about whether or not that would be beneficial. That's one option. By the way, there are a lot of other things that people can do that take, over the long term, such as meditation, regular exercise, be very careful with your diet. There are a lot of things that people can do that can help increase serotonin levels over the long run. It's not usually something, it's really hard to have a, transcendental meditation session right before every conflict situation at work. But that doesn't mean individuals don't have more options.
Shall we take one last question? Hold on one sec. Hold on. Okay. So could you state your name and agency and then answer?
I'm Lori Aniti. I'm from EIA. No, I was just wondering how fast these things, like if you turkey sandwiches or if there's other food. Speaking of Lori Aniti, EIA. I was wondering how fast a turkey sandwich would work. Would it work in time for the meeting? And are there other foods as well that increase serotonin?
About a half an hour, 45 minutes. It depends on how long your meeting is. Think of Thanksgiving dinner, and by the end of Thanksgiving dinner and people are chilling out, So if you have a long enough meeting, yeah, it would help. Food that has protein in it, a little bit of carbohydrates, a little bit of fat helps, but the focus on protein. Turkey just happens to be the meat that has the most tryptophan in it. But other sources of protein, not just meat, but non-meat proteins also have some tryptophan. I'm not a nutritionist, so I'm not exactly sure about the content of all the foods, but there are other foods that have it too, primarily protein. Sure.
One more question? David.
David Pritzker, Administrative Conference. I wasn't sure I wanted to ask my question publicly, but I'll do it. Very recently, I put myself voluntarily in a recreational setting where I was determined to do something that I was very fearful about trying. And while it was set up to be very safe, in the course of doing this, my body began shaking. And my question is, what, if anything, could I have done, because I was determined to succeed at this, what, if anything, could I have done to overcome that? There was clearly something involuntary happening that was competing with my determination to complete the task.
In the moment, you mean what could you have done at the moment? There are a number of things that you can do, including, breathing slowly and deeply. That can help. Sometimes there's some evidence to suggest that you can slow down your sympathetic nervous system by taking a series of short breaths, like and then calm, and then and calm. It's not perfect, but it can help. People who have more practice doing meditation can almost do a little bit of self-hypnosis and calm themselves down in the moment, but you have to, practice that beforehand. But I really applaud you for putting yourself in a situation where you really wanted to overcome your fear. That's great. That's, a lot of people
I'll tell you
wanted,
privately what I was doing.
Okay. A lot of people would just avoid that like the plague. So that's very good.
One last question? Okay. Going. All right, I want to thank you very much. I'm so pleased at all the things we learned. It was just chock full of information and tips and ways that we can apply it to the work that we do. And I'm convinced we need more food in our office now, right? Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. And I guess the third time was the charm.